Brad, I found myself on Usenet the other day.
That's a great place to be.
Well, I found myself on old Usenet on Google Groups.
That's an even better place to be. Well, I mean, I've certainly got my issues about how Google Groups has evolved over time, but
it's kind of what I wanted to talk about because I've noticed that the search on Google Groups has gotten worse.
Oh yeah, no, that's a years long problem. Like you can find like R's articles and stuff about it of people of complaints about like they are just letting Google Groups. To back up for a second, Google bought the Deja News Usenet archive years and years ago.
Like 20 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, it's been ages, but basically Google is in possession of a massive archive of Usenet from the, I don't know if it goes back to the probably the 80s, sometime in the 80s. Like, I mean,
it's definitely like the area I'm interested in is when it started getting popular in the 90s when people were using it as a message board.
Yes. But yeah, so like they integrated that entire archive into Google Groups. And then over time, the search functionality has continued to decay to the point that you can barely search, like you can't even really search in individual groups easily anymore. There's a big banner on there now. They are disabling the ability to post to Usenet through Google Groups very soon.
I'm kind of okay with that. I think
that's fine. Yes, I don't need to post to you. Although, what if I did? You
get a Usenet account. Download your Usenet reader of choice.
A, I should post to Usenet. B, if I was going to post to Usenet, I would do it through a command line.
Would you be where would you post, like alt.content. I
can tell you we've talked about this before. My frequent groups were alt.games.finalfantasy, rec.games.video.nintendo, and .sony, or was it .playstation? I don't quite remember. And then some of the computing ones that I don't quite remember.
See, I was more of an IRC guy. I always liked the ephemeral chat. The everlasting nature of Usenet.
Oh, I was on IRC for years, as we have well documented. alt.comp.perifs.mainboard.abit.
Oh, people are going to go find you now.
Oh, I mean, we've read these posts out loud on this podcast.
Just some
before.
of them.
Well, the search is broken, so don't bother.
You said you had a better alternative, though, now.
Yeah, I am a little concerned about the future of Google's Usenet archive. But I can't remember a user on one of our Discords turned me on to this. I apologize. I can't remember your name. Usenetarchives.com. Quite easy to find. I don't know where they're getting their data from. I'm not sure. This launched, I think, like 4 or 5 years ago. I found a Reddit post of the person who runs this announcing it. It's very slow. It's very slow.
I mean, that makes sense. It's like archive.org is slow too. It's pulling in a lot of data, and it's probably not super well funded.
So they have a Patreon up actually, so you can support this. I think this person said in their announcement post, like, hey, I'm throttling database hits because this is a huge database, like, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, there is an alternative now. Like, knowing there's another Usenet archive out there makes me feel just a little bit better.
Welcome to Brad and Will Made a Tech Pod. I'm Will.
I'm Brad. You're sounding guttural this week.
I'm a little deeper than normal, Brad. I'm just bringing it in low, because I've had a cough.
So, I thought you brought your bedroom voice or something.
No, if this was my bedroom voice, I don't even know what I'd do with that. That's too much power for me.
For this extremely sexy episode about Apple II 6502 assembly and making first-person shooters.
Yeah, I learned a surprising amount about old CPU assembly reading this book. So for folks who don't know, this week we are talking about the John Romero autobiography, I guess.
Autobiography? I kept calling it a memoir when I talked about it before because I think memoir sounds classy.
It's a little memoir-ish. John Romero's book, Doom Guy, Life in First Person. It's a memoir about his time so far, at least
on Earth,
making video games and also on Earth. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of the whole thing's intertwined, it seems like. Yes.
John Romero, famously of id Software, co-creator of Doom and Wolfenstein and Quake and all that stuff. We've talked about all these things ad infinitum around here.
Went on to launch Ion Storm, has made a bunch of mobile games and other stuff since then. Is working on a new title now in Ireland. But famously was the Doom and Wolfenstein, and to a lesser extent Wolfenstein, but he was kind of the public face of id Software during their prime.
Yes.
I think we can look back now and say that was the prime. I mean, I think actually I would say that id Software is kind of in the middle of another prime right now. But the thing that started the first person shooter as a genre and took over gaming for 10, 20 years started in the 90s. And that was a handful of people were involved in that.
Yeah. Something actually, I will just make a disclaimer right up front here that will go for this entire episode, which is that I kind of consider there to be two id Softwares. Like there's the scrappy, like 4 guys crammed in a rental house version.
Yeah.
Which, like, I know it became a much bigger company up through when John Carmack left, but like that's kind of like when he left is sort of when it became a different company, right? And like it is a very different studio now, run by mostly. I mean, there's still some veterans there, but like the output is different. I feel like there's a difference in clearly reading this book. There's like a difference in professionalism in cases, and like it seems it's much more of a real modern video game studio now. And like, I've been on record. Doom 2016 is one of the best games of the last decade.
Yeah, it's fabulous.
So they're doing great work over there. But when I talk about id Software, and when I talk about like, because I'm probably going to say things like, I feel like that's when it ended, or that's when like X stopped being the case or whatever. Like it's like I'm talking basically about two different companies here. I'm talking about like the original incarnation of that studio.
And it's worth mentioning, even like, when I went and played Doom 3, right, and Rage, even in that time period post, when it was a very different company than it was when they were making the original Doom and Quake, it was still small for that scale. For a developer that made games that many people played, they were always small. I think now it's a little different because the art constraints of a modern game engine are different. But
and also they've successfully become part of bigger and bigger companies, right? They got bought by Bethesda in like 2009 or something like that.
Who then got bought by Microsoft, and presumably at some point they're going to be bought by Weyland-Yutani or something. I don't know. We'll see.
Yes. Yeah. So maybe a better way to look at it is the dividing line between when they were still an independent studio and then became part of a bigger company.
Yeah.
Because I'm not going to say that like Carmack was the only person keeping things going there. Like by all accounts, it seems like he maybe was kind of not super involved for the last few years he was even there. So,
but we're not, that's not the stuff we're talking about today. The reason this time period is interesting to me, and I think to you as well, and to just technologists in general, is that in the late 90s, the work that was being done on games like first person shooters specifically, which were incredibly hardware dependent and demanding, drove an incredible amount of advancement forward in the PC space.
Yeah.
It also changed the tenor of the internet. Like the early internet was about like porn and Quake and Doom for lack of like,
okay, sure.
There were two things you could find on the early internet in ripe abundance: speculation about upcoming video games from id Software and other adjacent companies, and pornography.
Smut.
Yeah, there wasn't a whole lot. Like, it wasn't like there were blogs. There weren't. The first time I saw a recipe on the internet, I was like, wow, that's really weird. I never thought about doing that before.
Sure. Okay. Yes, sure.
But I also had 7 different blogs dedicated to reading plan files from game developers in Texas, saved on my bookmarks.
It occurs to me that that might be the availability of the material might be a reflection of the demographic that had early internet access.
You are not wrong, my friend.
But anyway, all that said, this book is really about his kind of whole life, honestly. Like, I came to it wanting to know about the ins and outs of that period of id Software, because Doom and Quake were life changing for me, and I wanted to know what happened behind the scenes there. But he really starts from the beginning. Like, you spend, I don't know, a fifth of the book maybe on his like childhood and teen years. Like, he absolutely does not skimp over his upbringing, his early exposure to computers, how he got into coding, how much of a coder he is. Like, that was a huge revelation for me reading this book, which we'll get into, is that like he is and was a hardcore programmer and solo game designer.
Well, and it's interesting because he starts from a period in time when like solo game design, there were 2 types of game designers in that like late 80s, early 90s time period. There were people at like the big, I'm air quoting big because they weren't really that big by today's standards, but like the Williamses making King's Quest and those games were big. They were industry titans, right?
Richard Garriott is I mean, I don't know if we'll go through this kind of chronologically, so we'll get there, but like his first real job in games was at Origin Systems of all places. And, you know, he and a lot of people idolized Richard Garriott at the time, who I think actually this book says like Garriott also was a serious coder, right? Like before Origin became big, like I think he was writing the games, right? Well,
because I was gonna say the other way you made games at that point was if you could kind of do everything and you were a one-stop shop. So like Romero started out, and a lot of these folks started out earlier making just writing code and turning that into games, and then putting those games in Ziploc bags and selling them at computer shows and screwdriver shops.
That's one of my favorite parts of this book. Is, I mean, we're skipping ahead a little bit. We should talk about his upbringing a bit because it does come into play later. I'm 15, 16 and selling games to magazines part was one of the most exciting parts of this to me. It sounds like so much fun.
It's kind of the bridge from like the old homebrew computer club and like the guys in Silicon Valley that were soldering chips onto boards and figuring it all out. And this is the bridge from that to, hey, computers can be a business and there's a reason for a computer to be in every home.
Yeah.
And that's to me the most interesting thing about this like 10 year period.
Yeah.
Looking back on it now, especially. So, okay. So Romero's childhood was rough. I'm going to say, if you're going to read the book, there's a lot of content warnings. There's stuff that is abusive and terrible and bad. He's like, he treats it really matter of factly and kind of unapologetically, and is like, hey, you know, I love my family. They have problems. And the childhood that I had is what shaped me into the person I am now. So I don't regret that.
Yeah.
But like some people are going to read this and be like, holy shit.
Yeah, there's some fairly rough stuff in there. It's and he also treats it with kind of a shocking amount of grace, I feel like.
Yeah.
For some of the stuff he went through and how sort of forgiving he is of a lot of those things. But
yeah, and it's the whole gamut of Gen X, you know, Gen X childhoods, right? It's like the substance abuse parent, the bad stepdad, the ambiguously bad stepdad. I don't know. The stepdad bought him his first Apple II and opened the door to a lot of stuff.
Stepdad is certainly an interesting figure in all of this.
Like, I think the remarkable thing about this book is that going through it and like the amount of drama that happened in this time period, there's not really a villain. I mean, there are people who definitely do bad things, but there's not anybody that he comes out as inimical to.
Yeah. Well, yeah. In his case, that's what I meant about the grace, you know, because I mean, there are some like very abusive figures here, or one in particular. But long story short, I found that section of the book incredibly engaging. Like that's what I was kind of getting at earlier when I came to this wanting to know about his time at id Software primarily, but like, you know, it's a good several chapters of just his childhood and how he got into computers as a teenager, and I was like gripped by the whole thing. It's told really vividly. There's also a lot of positivity in there, you know, like his just his like appreciation of his heritage, you know, his Mexican and indigenous lineage and culture, and you know, like you get a lot of positivity from him about his family life in the midst of all of the bad stuff.
Yeah, it feels like he's like, I mean, he says it later in the book, but he said writing the book was a reflection on everything that he's done and everything that he is, and it's made him understand himself better, which I get. Like I took that away from this whole thing.
Yeah, it was like that part of the book. It was I've not read a lot of autobiography or memoir type stuff, and this might actually be the first one that I've read in that vein. And like I was, you know, again, you want to read somebody's autobiography because they're famous and did something you want to know about. But then like I guess what I'm trying to say is I was just shocked how much I appreciated reading about his background, which was something I didn't think I was coming to the book for.
Well, there in my experience, there are like a couple of different kinds of these books. One is that I want to burn everything down. Fuck everybody. Let's air the airing of grievances.
The 20-year tell all.
Yeah. This is the other one. This is the, hey, I think I did okay, and I feel pretty good about where I ended up, but let's share the story, right? It's because it's a good story.
Yeah.
It's like the kid who came from nothing ended up being one of the first video game millionaires, you know, wildly successful rock star of the games industry. Like that's the kind of thing you can't write a soap opera about that, because people would be like, oh, there's no way that kid is going to, from the barrio is going to be able to do this. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Although ironically, they did write a TV show about this.
Okay, well, fair.
But I can't. Did that ever get produced?
I don't I don't think so. I would have watched the shit out of that. I'm sure.
I know that was it Masters of Doom that it was technically, I think they
optioned Masters of Doom.
That's what it was. And I know they cast those roles, but I don't know if they ever actually got around to shooting it or not.
So
anyway,
so the other part about this that's interesting is having read Masters of Doom, and it has been a minute since I read Masters of Doom, but this has that Hell's Angels electric Kool-Aid acid test vibe where two people are writing simultaneous books about things that are happening in real life in real time, and then they happen to cross paths. And you get in the middle, Hell's Angels written by Hunter Thompson. He went and lived with the Hell's Angels for a few years. Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test is written by Ken Kesey.
Tom Wolfe.
Tom Wolfe. It's about Ken Kesey, sorry. And they happen to end up at spending a summer together at a series of parties. So you can read these chapters in the middle of Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test and these chapters in the middle of Hell's Angels, and they're about the same place in the same period of time, but from completely different perspectives.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah. So,
I mean, he does mention Masters of Doom in this book, and I think he pretty much says he doesn't really disagree with anything in that book. I think
he said some of it's a little bit over dramatized.
Or yeah,
was the implication.
But the basic events. Pretty much there.
The events of this whole time are not seemingly there's not really a whole lot of disagreement about what happened.
No. Well, yeah. I mean, the big one is, and we'll get to this. I mean, the big one for me was when he left id, and we'll get there. But in that particular case, as you will see, the perspectives of the main figures involved there are very different. The stories that have been told about what happened are quite different.
So the interesting thing about me from the Apple, there's a moment early on after he's gotten his Apple II, he's a friend who lives near him that has an Apple II as well. And he's like, hey, do you want to see the code? The friend's sitting there. They're playing a game. I think it's Gorgon, which was a Apple II kind of intensive Apple II game back in the day. And also, I'm going to say, reading this book made me want to go download a bunch of old Apple II games and load them up on the Mister and get try these out, because I missed all of this.
Yeah, I still want to do that. Both some of his old solo games and also especially a lot of those games they churned out at Softdisk, which we'll talk about.
We should find a Saturday sometime and just have some fun. Anyway, he said, "Hey, do you want to see the code?" And he opens up the console and types in the assembler command to just dump the hexadecimal assembly language for the CPU. And Romero's like, what is this? And he's like, it's the first time I've ever seen hexadecimal. It's the first time I've ever seen the language that the machine speaks. And it's like it's a moment that I didn't have a friend who knew how to do that.
Right.
I didn't know anybody who knew. I didn't know that. I wasn't aware that. I assumed that everything on your computer was written in BASIC at that point in my life, probably.
Yeah. So he goes through this whole arc in there. I mean, if you're interested in early and low level programming, there's a ton of fun detail in there about this, where he started out with BASIC. He wrote some games in BASIC. You can absolutely do that on an Apple II, but he hits that moment where he realizes he needs more speed. Yeah. And the only way to get that is to learn the machine code, the 6502 assembly. And so it's very approachable. I'm not going to say it's too technical, but there's an amount of technical detail that I appreciate in there that even if you're a layperson, I think gives you a good sense of here's what BASIC can do, but here's how much harder it is, but also much faster. Yeah.
It passes the Goldilocks test there. It's just the right amount of nerd shit to not turn me off.
Yeah. And it's fun to read about. I'm trying to remember exactly what was it he committed to memory. He memorized all the hexadecimal for
all the addresses for the different commands. Yeah.
But also, I think also for the entire alphabet and base 10 numbers, right? Didn't he, just so he wouldn't have to look up the what's hexadecimal for F or whatever? I think he just kind of memorized all that stuff.
Well, so the fun thing about this was, it seemed like the typical nerd thing where you would go and hang out with other people and you'd compare notes about what you remembered and what you knew. And this was it, committing the entire thing to memory. So you didn't have to reference anything. You could just work straight out of your brain seemed like it's the early 90s equivalent of, or late 80s equivalent of a nerds doing keg stands.
Yes. So yes. Also, there's another thing we'll get to, but the contrast between who he actually is and was, or at least how he described himself, versus the late 90s, make you his bitch, long-haired rock star persona is profound here, because he didn't party through his teen years or anything. His long hair.
All of these guys are straight edge guys,
right? That's the thing. He's like super straight edge. Like you know, like he talks more about his long hair as like A, he didn't want to get a haircut, and then B, later he culturally kind of came to appreciate the long hair in regard to his heritage. But like, it was never, he was like he loved heavy metal, but he was not like out partying, doing coke and like drinking all the time. He was super straight edge. Yeah.
They were the other kind of heavy metal nerds, the nerds that just liked heavy metal and didn't like any of the stuff that heavy metal implied.
Right. Like they just listened to a lot of Iron Maiden and stuff and
just
coded
about
all the
Satan
time.
in music, not the drugs. It turns out.
Yeah. Like he describes himself as incredibly driven and single-minded about just wanting to program and make games and do nothing else. And he wouldn't do anything to get in the way of that.
And that comes up over and over again. At one point, when they moved, they all moved to Madison, Wisconsin together, and they just got apartments in the same apartment complex and had an extra one where they put all the computers so that nobody had to drive to get to work. Right. Like you just walk down the hallway to go to work because that's all they wanted to do.
Yeah.
When he's talking about being married in the id Software days, he's like, I'm coming home. I'm working all day. I'm coming home and I'm working on other stuff to figure out what we can do later on, and just always experimenting. There's an anecdote about when they did the same thing in Texas. They moved to Texas, got a bunch of apartments in this apartment complex, and the one where they work also has Carmack's bedroom upstairs. Right. Because I assume, because I'm guessing it's because the next workstation was in Carmack's house and they didn't want to buy two of them. So he'd have one at home so he could just work. And so anyway, he went and looked at Carmack's room one day and he's like, there's no bed. He's just sleeping on the floor. So he went out and bought a mattress for Carmack at that point, at that day, and chucked a mattress on the floor so he could sleep get some good sleep.
Yeah, I think that might have been in Madison in Wisconsin when they were doing Wolfenstein or pre-Wolfenstein. But yeah, the way he describes the bedroom, he had no bed. There was a pillow, a lamp, and a stack of computer books on the floor next to a blanket. He had no bed. I felt sorry for him. How could you sleep on the floor and still work long hours and not be fatigued? Yeah. Anyway. So like, long story short, I mean, we can kind of skip over some of the events, but he spends his teen years making games by himself, selling them to magazines.
And that transaction is really fascinating because I think it worked out because he'd buy a computer magazine. He'd be like, oh, I like the games in this magazine. He'd call the phone number or send a letter to the masthead address and say, hey, I have some games. Do you want to buy them? And then they'd send him a few $100s for the games.
Right. Yeah. There's a real self-starting quality to a lot of this stuff that I appreciate, of just like maybe some kind of stuff that I maybe wish I had done a little more of when I was younger, of like, he didn't feel intimidated or
a massive amount of confidence for somebody that's 16 or 17 years old is what I would say.
Yeah, that's what it is. It's like, like you said, like he just looked at the masthead, saw there was a phone number, and just called it. He didn't feel intimidated by doing that, it didn't not occur to him to do that. He just kind of reached out and got himself into it.
Well, it's also interesting because there was kind of an in-between place too for people who were fledgling game designers, right? There wasn't, like, you weren't going to sell a boxed copy at that point. And this was before games were at Walmart or probably stuff like, I guess, EB and Babbage's and games stores like that existed, but they were pretty rare and not definitely in every town at that point. So mostly people got software through word of mouth, or a computer show would come through your town once or twice a year, and you'd go and there'd be just like bins filled with tall Ziploc bags with a manual and a couple of floppy disks in them, one or two. And that was how you got games. Or you had a friend who went to those things and then copied the floppies, which we weren't supposed to copy the floppies, but here we are.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, a lot of those games had like very generic alliterative titles like Crazy Climber and Dangerous Dave and you know what I mean? Like Terrible Towers.
Or they were just straight knockoffs of like arcade games or whatever. So
that's one of my favorite moments in this entire book is when he was first learning to he talks about how obsessed he was with playing, I think it's Asteroids, right? Was the arcade game that he absolutely loved and was like constantly trying to scrounge quarters to go play Asteroids. Like, part of the reason he got so excited about programming, making his own games, is he realized he could just write his own Asteroids clone and then play it forever for free.
Yeah. And like that whole, but that whole, like having a place where you could sell your work that wasn't a commercial product, but would still get you a little bit of money was a really powerful thing, because it let him build a library of software that he had made and could pull ideas from and move, port forward and a bunch of other things in time that he was still making a little bit of money on every month. Now, were those magazines absolutely underpaying the kids that were sending in, homebrew games, almost certainly. But it's a place that kind of didn't exist in the modern context for a long time, and now we're starting to see it come back with like itch and some of the indie kind of hey, here's a place where you can put your game up for free or for 10 cents, 20, a buck or two or whatever.
Yeah, it's cool. Last thing I'll say about this era is when this book came out last year, Jordan Mechner, the creator of Prince of Persia, who I guess Romero idolized, Mechner on his Twitter account went and posted a scan of a letter that a very young John Romero sent him right after. Oh my God. Did you not see this?
No, I missed this.
You have to go look this up. It is incredible. It's like 2 pages. I'll try to find it and link it in the show notes, but I think Romero's like 17 or something. And it's basically fan mail to Mechner about how much he likes, I think it's Prince of Persia, or maybe it was Karateka. I think it might have been Karateka is what he wrote in about.
Probably Karateka, yeah.
But it's a lot of fawning praise for Mechner's work. It's a lot of geeky shit. It's like, oh, you must be using page flipping to do animation like that, right? Like he gets into the weeds of the programming stuff. And then he also promotes his own work in a way that is absolutely hilarious.
Oh, I love this.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a real, it's clearly printed on a dot matrix printer too.
Yes.
With like robot logos. It looks like it's made in Print Shop Pro. This is incredible.
Yeah,
I'll put the link in so you can chuck it in show notes.
It's got amazing letterhead on it, like dot matrix looking letterhead. Greetings, Earthling, with little printed out robots at the top. Anyway,
wow.
My favorite part of when he's talking about his own work, the game is called The Pyramids of Egypt. Many people feel that it is better than Lode Runner, and almost everybody yells out Tutankhamun when they first see it. Anyway.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's good stuff. But anyway, like, it goes from like his kind of teen years doing homebrew single person game development with an outlet in magazines and stuff. Like he ends up at Origin Systems working for Richard Garriott for a while. And then long story short, he ultimately goes down to Softdisk in Louisiana. Shreveport, Louisiana, which is where he meets most of the people who would then go on to found his software. Softdisk, like, that is just a business model that is so time and place. Like the way they were operating, like they were basically selling subscription software to computer enthusiasts.
But they weren't selling like software you pay monthly for. They were paying like every month you pay them money and they'd send you a disk full of software.
Right. And you didn't necessarily know what you were. I mean, it was kind of like an early blind box, right? Or an early, like one of these services of like, hey, pay us money and we will send you some stuff, because you didn't know exactly what you were. I'm sure they promoted some of what was upcoming, but they just had a bunch of in-house developers making games, making productivity applets, little programs, and you just kind of got stuff on a disk.
Yeah, I think that's probably that seems like it, right? You'd get the like 1 month it would be a couple of games and a spreadsheet. 1 month it would be something else. Like it was just, if you think about it, this business model ended up moving to magazines eventually, because like this is what Chris Anderson did with Future in the UK, where they would bundle a magazine with a CD that was full, a floppy disk that was full of software. It was the same thing, just they had a magazine, so they had a place to put it in grocery stores and newsstands. The interesting thing about this was the person who owned this who owned Softdisk comes across as a very favorable character and somebody who kind of like took them under their wing and set them up as a skunk works to build cool games and like it seems like it worked for a while, right?
Yeah. Al Vakovius is the founder that you're talking about here. He absolutely comes off as a very magnanimous figure, because this is the point where they were there to make games, of course. Like that's where this company ultimately they found John Carmack and convinced him to come down from like Kansas or whatever and work there, and like Tom Hall, like the whole gang.
Eventually they recruit Carmack to come in there.
Yes, like the whole gang of early id Software is basically at Softdisk at this point, and they're tasked with making games, of course, and specifically the cadence they're tasked with is churning out a game every month. Well, like they literally are making like 12 games a year, which is completely crazy.
But this is where that homebrew scene comes in. And it's a simpler time. The art demands on a game in 1991 pretty thin by today's standards.
Of course.
But also they were taking their old like Apple II games and porting them over to PC and Amiga. I think they were originally doing Amiga stuff, right? At Softdisk.
Maybe I'm not sure.
Maybe no. It was other people were doing Amiga stuff. It was But yeah, so they were porting their old games up to new platforms. They were making sequels to games that they already had. But also that cadence forced them to think about things differently. So like they were building tooling to make levels that then would work in future games that they made, so that they wouldn't have to make the tools to make the games over and over again, or somebody who wasn't writing in assembly could make the game, make the art and the content for the game while somebody else was, I don't want to say game engine because they weren't exactly there yet, but it was the foundational work that became, hey, if we separate the thing that makes the game run and the content that's in the game, then it becomes a technological advantage that we have that lets us work faster and better and all that.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is around the period, from what I remember reading the book, this is around when you start seeing some of the first exciting, like big innovations in PC game tech happening. Yeah. So I think this is where Carmack figures out the smooth scrolling without video hardware stuff for 2D games, which is, I think before Commander Keen, they made a game or two for Softdisk that utilized that technology where it was a vertical scrolling shooter. I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head.
So they made, but the horizontal scrolling was the big jump.
Right. Well, you can scroll in either direction. Like it was the smoothness of it was the thing, because stuff like the NES had specialized hardware to be able to be clear, to scroll graphics, tiles, sprites, whatever, smoothly across the screen. I think tiles in particular. Stuff like the NES had special hardware to do that. You can't just do that easily in software. And I think there's descriptions in there of like you're using like stuff about the video output hardware of the computer to like you're taking advantage
overscan or something, right? Like was the trick.
I forget how it works exactly, but you're literally taking advantage of how like electrically the video signal goes out to the screen and stuff like that. Like some really interesting stuff. But the Softdisk, where they were just churning these games out, is where they started figuring some of that stuff out.
The thing with that especially is that, according to Romero's book at least, Carmack had done this thing and he brought in and was like, hey, look at, is this cool? And showed them the demo, and everybody came in and was like, oh, that's really cool. And Romero was like, oh my God, we've got to make a game with this right now.
Right. Like the rest of the company looked at it and was just like, okay, cool, good job. Like pat on the back and just walked off. Right. Like nobody, like most of the people there didn't seem to grasp how momentous this was.
Well, that it was a competitive advantage. Right. The other thing that's worth mentioning here is that the demo that they made was Super Mario Brothers 3.
Yeah.
And they coded it up over a weekend or something and sent it to Nintendo with a note that was like, hey, we'd love to make a PC port of Super Mario Brothers. Will you let us do that? And so the Nintendo was like, no, we're cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Yes. Which of course famously is what led to Commander Keen, and the rest was history. But, eventually they get out of Softdisk. They all realize like, hey, we can do this for ourselves. Like we should give this a shot. But the thing I was going to say before we move on about Vukovius, the founder, like their boss, there's some really hilarious, like slapdash sort of business practices or behavior going on here. Like primarily, he describes quite vividly how they would wait for everybody to leave the office on Friday evening.
Yeah.
And then they would roll their cars up and take all of their work computers home for the weekend and make their own games on their work machines at home all weekend, and then take them back late Sunday night. And I don't know if the management of Softdisk knew about that stuff or not, but like a lot of companies absolutely would not let you get away with that.
Well, it seems like, I mean, look, one of the first things they tell you when you start out in a tech company is don't use your work computer for personal projects because you're going to get sued. Like, given what we know now, had Al Vukovius decided to go after them in court, especially in Louisiana, he probably could have claimed a fair amount of Wolfenstein and Commander Keen as his property.
Right.
But also, like, that whole vibe in that company was like, hey, here's the old staid spreadsheet guys. And then they brought in the young weirdos to make the metal guys to make video games. And he was very aware that they were driving his business in a specific direction that was helping him.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened to Softdisk. I did a little bit of looking and it just kind of disappeared after a while. This is one of the things I was looking for on Usenet.
Yeah, it seems like looking at their Wikipedia, it just kind of like faded out of existence.
Ran out of gas.
Like even the Wikipedia is pretty vague about like as of 2006, their website directed to that of Bayou Internet. So like it's a little unclear what exactly happened there, but
I mean, there were a lot of like mid 90s internet businesses that were like an ISP with a BBS attached to it with a couple of other things. And it may be that he just kind of ended up in this weird business because it seemed like a good idea at the time, right?
Yeah. The Big Blue Disc. This reminds me of the thing.
I remember that.
Their monthly product that the id guys were making games for was called the Big Blue Disc.
So 1.4 megabyte double-sided floppy, right?
Probably. But anyway, like the management, like Wachovia specifically, like basically let them go with a smile, kind of like wished them well, right? Like they didn't try anything to like stop them from going independent or try to retain them, or specifically to like go after them legally in any fashion. They basically just were like, go, like, I wish you well.
They committed to making a few more games for him.
Yes, and that's what it was.
That was the deal. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So they did fulfill a contract, but then they were free and clear.
So they moved to Madison.
Yes.
As a group. I think because Raven Software was there is the vibe that I got from the book, but I don't think he explicitly says that.
Were they there?
Yeah, they were there then.
Were they? Okay.
Yeah.
I think it was also just a cheap college town. I think like they just needed a place to be that was
inexpensive,
cheap, and had like good tech access to stuff. And yeah,
Wisconsin, not where I would go probably.
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, I guess if you never leave your apartment, Wisconsin's great.
Yes, although there is a description in there of when they got their first Next machine, Carmack like walking through the snow to the bank
to get a cashier's check or something,
take out the loan or the cash or whatever to buy the $11,000 Next workstation that they then used to make Wolfenstein.
Oh, the other thing I wanted to say from that first period is that when he started at Origin, the manager or someone at Origin was like, you're never going to make more than $40,000 a year making video games. Just to be clear, this is like, I think they paid him $22,000 a year to do that. And he was thrilled, of course.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as Commander Keen checks started coming in. So while they were at Softdisk, they met Scott Miller from Apogee.
Yes.
And Apogee was foundational in the shareware model, which is we'll give away part of the game, usually about a third, for free. And then if you want to play the rest of it, you send us a check or a money order. You call us, give us your credit card number, and we'll send you the other 2 discs. And that's how they shipped Commander Keen. The Commander Keen was sold as a shareware model. Wolfenstein later, and Doom, Quake, all of these were sold shareware model. Different publishers for, I guess, Doom. Doom was Softdisk. It was still Apogee, right?
I think
they moved it in house by then.
I believe as of Doom, they were doing their own shareware fulfillment because they're later they start becoming pretty dissatisfied with the efficiency of Apogee's operation, let's say, in terms of taking orders and fulfilling them efficiently. That's right. I believe Doom was their first like in-house shareware game, and then Doom 2 was published by GT Interactive because that was a retail deal, which I believe GT Interactive, I found out through this book, was affiliated with Walmart in some way, if I'm not mistaken.
They had a Walmart deal. They had a Walmart distribution deal. Yeah. And that immediately gave them access to millions of units sold.
Yes. Anyway, we're skipping ahead a little bit there, but yeah, like that's the gist of it, is that they kind of started developing the smooth scrolling 2D tech while at Softdisk. They went on and used that to make all the Commander Keens, which made quite a bit of money. They got hooked up with Apogee, which allowed them to adopt the shareware model for Keen. And I think, when does the 3D stuff start coming in? Because there's also talk about they made a 3D game before Wolfenstein. Was it like hover tank?
It was like a battle zone type thing, right?
Yeah, it was some sort of hover tank. The name is escaping me right now, but.
So they made a couple of 3D things, and when basically they were starting out literally sitting down to start work on the third trilogy of Keen. Carmack had figured out how to do bit flipping so they could have parallaxed foregrounds and backgrounds on the 2D platformer. And I think he says Adrian Carmack looks over and it's like, I'm not super excited about this. And everybody around the room was like, yeah, I'm not stoked about making another 3 episodes of Keen. So they talk about it. What do we want to do? Blah, 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 blah. And they come up with Doom, Wolfenstein, basically on the spot.
Yep.
The design they wanted to, there was a game called Castle Wolfenstein that was an Apple II game that was like an early stealth kind of combat game. And they wanted to do that whole thing. they went through the whole, he talks through the design era and iteration on that. And it eventually became clear that like running through mazes and shooting Nazis is always fun. The stealth stuff was less necessary in the first person context. Carmack realized that they could do, as long as they didn't do ceilings and floors, he could have fully rendered, textured.
Yeah.
Texturing was new then.
There's a great interlude in there about who is it that they talked to on the phone? Another well-known game developer. I forgot. Was it? Gosh, it's not Warren Spector. It was somebody of that caliber, though.
It was before Warren Spector.
But there's like an excited telephone conversation described in here about this amazing new technique called texture mapping.
So Hover Tank 1 and Catacomb 3D.
Yes, those were the
first ones that they had made.
Yes, the 3D games. Which I think one of those might have been for Softdisk. But anyway, like they had been doing rudimentary 3D technology at that point. And that's a lot of this. That's some of the stuff I found the most intriguing. Of course, I did in this book was the description of the evolving technology behind the games they were doing and how they came to those innovations.
So Paul Neurath was the one who right. talked to him about texture maps first.
Yes, that's right.
I believe that is what ended up being Ultima Underground.
Underworld.
Ultima Underworld.
Yeah, I believe that he actually says Ultima Underworld shipped first with textures before they did.
Yeah, but it was slow.
They were not the only ones out there doing 3D games at this point, of course, but they, it was the manic gunplay aspect of their 3D games, obviously, that is what really defined them.
And just, like I was in college by this point, I guess, or at least there was a moment when in my freshman year of college when everybody on the floor discovered Wolfenstein, and it went from like computers were mostly being used to write papers and do school stuff and like occasionally play I don't know, probably like XCOM or something like that, to oh my god, everybody's playing Wolfenstein if they have a computer that can run Wolfenstein.
Right. There's talk of that in here, of course, and that got even worse with Doom. But there's talk of like down the halls at Microsoft, like after Wolfenstein came out, like literally everyone at Microsoft was just playing Wolfenstein constantly.
Yeah. So yeah, they made Wolfenstein, and they made it on the shareware model with Apogee. Immediately, they were making more money than they had ever imagined that they could make.
Right. I think that was the inflection point. I mean, they talk about like Keen was quite successful. Like they certainly made good money from Keen, and he goes into the finances of the company quite a bit in terms of how much they were paying themselves, how much they were socking away for to keep the company going. But yeah, Keen was very good money. Wolfenstein was like, oh, we're rich now.
And the other interesting thing about Keen that I forgot is that they didn't have like exclusivity with anyone for any of these games at this point. So like there's a couple of retail Keen games that aren't on the shareware model that just got released and went out to stores and box copies and stuff like that. There's Wolfenstein is when they established the first version the first game on a new tech will be shareware, and then the follow up while they're working on the next engine will be a box copy that we sell on retail right. shelves. That's how Spear of Destiny came around.
Right. And I think Spear of Destiny, while they were around the time they were doing Spear of Destiny, is when they moved to Texas, if I'm not mistaken.
I think that's correct. Yeah. They talk a little bit about the Xbox port of, I think, Wolfenstein. I mean, sorry, not the Xbox SNES port of Wolfenstein.
Yeah, so I think I alluded to that on a recent episode. That was one of the most profound moments of this book to me.
Which was?
If you followed like the development of Quake back in the day and you were familiar with the idea of a BSP tree, binary space partition, that was something that was talked about a lot as Quake was coming out in terms of how can this game how can this game have such complex 3D environments and yet run so fast? Like no game looks like this and does this. What the hell? So the gist of what happened was they signed a deal with, I forget which Japanese publisher, but they signed a deal with somebody to port Wolfenstein to the Super Nintendo, Super Famicom.
Like a cash upfront deal. Kind of deal.
Chemco? I can't remember who the company was. Anyway, they farmed the port out because this is like kind of late Wolfenstein pre-Doom era. Or they're kind of getting going on Doom. I think Carmack maybe was architecting the next technology or whatever. And they farmed the port out to a programmer they knew, left him alone to work on it for X number of months or a year or more. Close to the time that the port was due to the publisher, they checked in and this person was basically like nowhere to be seen with like no real work to speak of.
to the point that he doesn't name this person in the book, I don't think.
Yes. And so they basically had to get a port to Super Nintendo of Wolfenstein together in like 2 weeks, I believe.
Yeah, so they basically did all hands, dropped everything, and immediately started working on it.
But the Super Nintendo, not a super capable piece of hardware by that time, especially for a game like Wolfenstein. And so, long story short, Carmack discovered essentially binary space partitioning as a way to get Wolfenstein to run on the Super Nintendo. It was purely out of like frantic necessity of, oh my God, we have to fulfill this contract. How are we going to get this game to run acceptably on this limited game console? And he basically came to a sort of, I don't know, data structure technique, I guess you would call it, that then became like the core of Doom and then Quake. Like that was a huge part of allowing those games to run as fast, as smoothly as they did on the hardware that they ran on at the time.
Yeah.
Like it's entirely possible that had that Wolfenstein dust up not happened, the tech for Doom and Quake would not have evolved as rapidly as it did. Like, it's just a great example of like, necessity breeding invention, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So and like, it's funny because that's the kind of story of the whole way through, right? Is that they figured something out and then something else was hard. And while they were figuring that out, they did something else and they bounced around a lot.
Yeah.
So while after Wolfenstein was done, Carmack was working on Doom. After the SNES port of Wolfenstein came out or was sent off, they, the other thing that was interesting about the SNES port is that they did it they didn't use official Nintendo dev kits for it.
Yeah. Yes.
They had some bootleg. Hold on.
I've got it. I've had the tab open on my phone since I read this book. Let me try to, I think was it called the Sluggo 3? I believe I may have closed. Yep. There it is. The Sluggo 3, Roman numeral 3. It was a like homebrew Super Nintendo development box, which I believe, did it go to court? I can't remember if Nintendo like sued over this, but I
don't remember. I don't know about that.
For some reason, I believe it was deemed to be legal. It was literally just like somebody reverse engineered the Super Nintendo development process and put together their own like dev kit debugger kind of thing.
Yeah. So dev kits and debuggers are what you use to kind of step through code and they make it possible to write code on one device and pump it into the other machine. So you can, in a way that you can like work on it and find out what's wrong with it as things are going bad. Yeah.
So that was an amazing factoid to come across, that there was this whole homebrew scene of bootleg Super Nintendo development kits out there. And that's what they used to make that port.
Well, the other thing interesting about the Wolfenstein time is it's when they started trying to shop around the engine. So they had some developers that they liked. They liked Raven up in Wisconsin. They liked a couple of other people, and they were like, hey, the Wolfenstein engine's available if you want to use it, and kind of didn't get a whole lot of bites. Like people weren't super into it.
Although to be clear, I mean, like the idea of licensing an engine did not exist at that time. I think even when they did sign deals, it was basically just like, here are some discs with our source code on it. Have fun.
Yeah. And like there's a point later in the book where they're like, hey, we have to figure out how we keep people from just using the source code for more games than just the one, which I thought was pretty funny. But when Doom came out, Doom was such a transformative, revolutionary. So first off, they released a press release after Wolfenstein when they were working on Doom while Spear of Destiny was in development that basically goes through and describes kind of their high level feature list,
like what Doom's going to be.
Yeah, what is Doom?
I don't have it in front of me, but I feel like I remember it having a fair amount of like the heavy metal 20-something swagger to it, right? Like
it's it reads like a press release written. I'm going to read it actually.
Okay.
So it says id Software to unleash Doom on the PC, revolutionary programming and advanced design make for great gameplay. Heralding another technical revolution in PC programming, id Software's Doom promises to push back the boundaries of what was thought possible on a 386 SX or better computer. Well, that was a lie. It didn't run on an SX. The company plans to release Doom in the third quarter of 1993 with versions for PC, in DOS, Windows NT, and a version for the next. In Doom, you play one of 4 off-duty soldiers suddenly thrown in the middle of an interdimensional war, stationed at a scientific research facility, blah, 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 blah. Demon's first episode will be with shareware. When you register, you receive the next 2 episodes, which feature a journey into another dimension, filled to its hellish horizon with fire and flesh. They talk about the technical stuff, though. So the game may takes up to 4 players through a futuristic world where they may cooperate or compete to beat the invading creatures. Mm-hmm. It boasts a much more active environment than its previous effort, Wolfenstein 3D, while retaining the pulse-pounding action and excitement. Doom features a fantastic, fully texture-mapped environment, a host of technical tour de forces to surprise the eyes, multiple player option, and smooth gameplay on any 386 or better.
I wouldn't say all of that quite came to pass.
I mean, they like a 386 DX could run it fine because I bought a 387 chip to make mine a DX.
Sure.
There's a Carmack quote that says Wolfenstein is primitive compared to Doom. We're doing Doom the right way this time. I've had some very good insights and optimizations that will make Doom engine perform at a great frame rate. The game runs fine on a 386 SX and on a 486-33. We're talking 35 frames per second, fully texture mapped at normal detail for a large area of the screen. That's the fastest texture mapping around, period.
Yeah. I mean, it's not wrong.
And then they defined texture mapping because nobody knew what texture mapping was at that point.
That's pretty great. The thing generally I was going to say about the description of the Doom development process, like it sounds like the peak of their creative output. That
I think so. Yeah.
It's everyone there firing on all cylinders and making this legendary seminal game, like one of the best games ever made, comes together in like less than a year, like a matter of months. Like the technology is just there. The art, the map design in particular, like he spends a lot of time talking about his map design,
like process. Individual notes in the map, to the point that when I was sitting waiting to pick up my kid from a thing, and I was sitting reading this on my phone. I was like, I wonder if I can get Doom on my iPhone. I downloaded Doom on my iPhone sitting in the parking lot and played through the levels as he'd talk about the level, and then I'd open it up on the phone, and it was interesting hearing the notes from him about how he designed some of those levels and then playing them directly.
Yeah.
But B, it's crazy that here 30 years later, I have a thing in my pocket that not only can I read his book on, but also I can just open up the game from 30 years ago that required a really expensive ass PC and it just plays. The controls aren't great, but what are you going to do?
Yeah. Well, it's research. But he talks a lot about his map design process in this, and like I feel like that kind of thing can very easily go up its own ass, but the way he talks about it is very down to earth, but very descriptive about, like he wanted each of his Doom maps to tell an implicit story, like talking about like rising and falling tension and like misdirection and how to reveal secrets. And like, it's a really studied description of his approach to how to make a map he's made some incredible maps across different contexts. So like he clearly is onto something with that.
Yeah. Using sound cues. It's funny. This is the thing that I expected. Cause like when back in the day, when Carmack would post something to his plan file, it was always about like the interaction of photons on a glass surface having some sort of weird highlights. When Romero would post stuff, it was about game features and game design stuff. Yeah. So I had always assumed, I didn't really appreciate that Romero was also like a low level coder and built all of the tools for the early id games, right? Like the game engine tools, the texture formatters, all that stuff was built with him. The bits about the map design were really interesting because he did talk a lot about like this is later on some of the sigil, which is his like post everything else pretty much revisit, going back to the old days and writing new Doom maps in the 2010s, early 2020.
The unofficial official fifth episode of Doom, I guess. Was it fifth or fourth? I think it's fifth
because it comes after the fourth, and then he also did one for Doom 2 that is like the beginning. The end that basically he built a bridge between Doom 1 and Doom 2 that we only got in a cutscene previously. But he talks about that, and he talks about having levels where you come in and you can see the exit. Like you can see the exit, and then it's up to you to figure out how to traverse that map and what sequence of events you have to go through, and how making it a puzzle box makes those traversing those mazes a little bit more engaging and fun, which I love.
Yeah.
He talks about, fast forward, the game came out, they sold a bazillion copies.
Yeah. Yes. Like Wolfenstein made them rich. Doom made them like filthy rich, became an absolute cultural phenomenon. We all know that story.
He tells the story of when he had to go to, when they decided to pay themselves bonuses and they each gave themselves $100,000. They went to the Ferrari dealership and bought Ferraris. Right.
Yeah. There's some amount of that kind of new money, wish fulfillment stuff in here of like, bunch of young guys suddenly with a bunch of money. Here's what they did with it.
Yeah.
Built houses, the whole thing.
And then they roll straight into Doom 2. Right.
Yeah.
So at this point, Carmack kind of branches off. He starts working on the next engine for the next game. And the art team and the game team go on and just make more levels. Because by this point, they had a GT Interactive deal that would put their game in Walmart. Right. Basically, which Yes, as a box product, you went to the store to buy.
Yeah, and there's a lot of threads converging here as you read this book. If you really lived through this time or care about this history a lot, where like I think wasn't it Doom 2 was the first game where he went to a big lavish sort of launch party organized by the publisher.
I think so. Yeah,
and was like kind of blown away that a company would spend this much money to throw a party like this about a game they had made. But it's also kind of leading up to the promotion heavy late 90s with the Daikatana advertising and stuff. It was like kind of the start of these types of games driving huge profits, and therefore like bigger companies and other influences coming in and taking them in different directions.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, at this point, the rise of the 486 and all the 486 clones meant that there were an incredible number of PCs that could run, and also the decline of all of the competing architectures for all intents. The Mac was still around. People were still using Amigas at this point. But for the most part, if you had a PC, it was an Intel machine or an Intel compatible machine. And the fact that Doom ran on those, didn't require any weird hardware like a 3D accelerator yet at this point, meant that there was a huge market for these games. And when people played them, they immediately got hooked, right? Like it was unlike anything you'd ever played before.
Yes,
and this was just using a keyboard. Like at this point, hardly anybody was playing with a mouse. Like this was you using the Alt keys to strafe, and using your arrow keys to move and shooting with control or space, right?
Yep.
So they're working on Doom 2. At this point, the licensing stuff starts to take off because Raven was they published basically Heretic. They entered into a publisher deal where they gave Raven an advance and said, "Hey, make this game. We want a swords and sorcery game set in the Doom engine, and we'll teach you how to use the next." Because they built the level editor, all that stuff was running on Next hardware. So here you can set yourself up with Next hardware. We'll teach you how to use it. And Romero was basically running that while they were doing the Doom 2 level design and box design.
Yeah. So those threads, and this is where his upbringing starts to come back into things. Like he talks about, having come from a poor family and like an abusive situation and stuff. Like it kind of embedded certain behaviors in him in terms of like wanting to always make sure there was enough, like he always wanted to make sure there was enough revenue coming into the company to make sure that it kept running. Et cetera, et cetera. Even when they were between games, like that's where the Heretic, by his description, that's where the Heretic deal came from. The map packs, like he talked about, like he's spearheaded or was fairly instrumental in the map packs that got put out in places like Walmart, the kind of episode bundles, the Ultimate Doom, stuff like that, re-releases. Like he kind of...
Well, that was so there would be a retail version of Doom 1 in those stores, because up until that point, the only way to get Doom 1 was with shareware, which was by now was not a mainstream thing anymore. It was edge again.
Right. So it's like where what I'm building up to here is what eventually kind of broke this whole partnership was... by his description, he wanted to make sure they had a lot of irons in the fire at all times. They needed to strike while the iron was hot to continue the metaphor. But like, he was out there doing all these deals. And then it turned out that Carmack very much thought everyone should be single-minded and head down on the next game all the time, constantly. And that's where we're headed as we come out of Doom into Quake. And that converged with a couple of other problems that led to the extremely famous, kind of sundering of the original id lineup. Also, we should mention Tom Hall was let go during Doom. Doom was not 100% a smooth, harmonious process, let's say, because he had much bigger ambitions around like story and narrative in the game, which is where I think a lot of that like playthrough with up to 3 friends and cooperate or not type stuff came from. And then but by Romero's accounting, he was not as down with the just balls out heavy metal action angle and was kind of not as into what they were doing. And so they kind of parted ways with him. And then we get to Quake.
Yeah. So Quake, hold on. One last thing. Doom 2 is the first time they made the game knowing that there was going to be multiplayer. Like it's the first time they built the maps for the game with an eye toward both single player and multiplayer. So there were some maps. I think he specifically lists Circle of Death, which is I think 15 in Doom 2 15. I can't remember. As hey, we built this so that it would run. So that like it had a loop so that players would run a circuit basically as they're chasing each other. And that was a new concept because most of the Doom 1 maps were linear and would go straight from one end to the other. And there was no kind of cutback from the beginning to the end. So a lot of them weren't great for more than one or two people in the game at a time, which was fine because most people at that point were playing on modems. Right. But they also talk about Dwango, which I had almost completely forgotten about. Yeah. Dwango was like it was basically a dial-in. It basically worked like a message board, but instead of sharing text, you dialed in and you'd connect to three other people who wanted to play Doom Deathmatch locally with you, which was like revolutionary, big deal at the time. You paid $10 a month for it. It was a huge expensive thing.
Yes. Anyway. And then of course Dwango's business model immediately was destroyed as games started adopting internet multiplayer directly thereafter. But that was a fun detail. We could sit here for 3 hours going through amazing details in this. There's one more I want to bring up and then we should really move on. But there's a really fun, breathless, vivid description of how Deathmatch came to be or how multiplayer in Doom came to be at all.
Yeah.
Which was like a month or like less than 2 months before the game released. Like they hadn't even like implemented the network play. Like they kind of didn't even know what they were going to do with it. And like Carmack basically just hacked the networking into the game, 6 weeks before ship or something like that.
Yeah.
And kind of they just applied the existing mechanics they already had for the single player to what it would be like to shoot each other. But the way he talks about the first time they sat in different rooms in their office and shot rockets at each other.
Just seeing another player move on the screen, like honestly,
it really took me back to the first time I ever played Doom over a modem against somebody. It was just like the description, like the idea that you could see another player moving around who was not in the same room with you, moving around in the virtual space. Like the description of that is so much fun.
I remember going to the computer lab and being like, hey, are you the orange one? I don't know what color I am. I'm moving to the right now. And like having this whole conversation about what you were seeing because you'd never seen that before. It was a novel thing. Anyway.
Yeah.
So then they went on to Quake and Quake was fraught.
Quake is one of my favorite games ever. It's also seemingly where everything went bad.
I was going to say, I had the same exact reaction. I was super bummed out reading this whole section just because I love Quake so much. And it seems like it destroyed a bunch of people.
Yeah, like the death march they ended up on to get that game out the door was really, I had no idea it was quite that rough. I knew something like that had happened, but
well, the main cause seems to be that the engine side took way longer to develop than they expected.
Yeah, so they had massive ambitions for Quake. They thought that they had to come out of Doom with something that blew Doom out of the water, that needed to be utterly revolutionary, and so the technical task that Carmack set for himself seems to be, it was not insurmountable because he eventually got there.
Yeah.
But a bunch of things happened here. Carmack kind of spec'd out too many advanced features that had never been done before in one game.
Specifically like the full 3D world and then also the client server architecture for multiplayer.
Yeah. At the same time, they decided to build a game around their long running D&D campaign and world that it's fun. It's a fun little, he goes back to this repeatedly. They've been playing D&D for years at this point and had this whole world with this epic hero named Quake and all this other stuff. And they literally wanted to turn their long running D&D campaign into their next game. But that meant a lot like a big break from the shooter gameplay they'd been doing. It was a lot more like melee combat with a hammer and a bunch of like RPG features. And we've talked about this.
A buddy that can drain enemies and stuff like that behind you. Yeah.
Yeah. When we did the Quake 25th anniversary episode a couple of years ago, we talked more about this stuff. And so like we got the Carmack side of how all this went down publicly 25 years ago. And we talked about that in that episode. But this is where, I don't know. I assume this
they also talked about it in Masters of Doom a fair amount as well.
Yeah, but this is the first place I think that Romero has given his full first-person account of
I think so,
his side of things. Long story short, the tech took forever to come together because they were doing true 3D spaces with like rooms on top of rooms, which had never been done before. They were doing a client-server model, which had never been done before. They were doing like radiosity and really advanced lighting, like just the...
This is the first place I saw light maps ever.
Right.
I think.
Like the technical mountain that Carmack had to climb to get all this stuff done turned out to be huge. And effectively the people tasked with making the enemies and the levels and the textures and all that stuff were not really able to get to work properly because the engine was not ready. And like they kept having to throw work out. Like they didn't know exactly what they had to work with. Like it sounded like a lot of spinning wheels for the better part of a year while the tech slowly came together.
And just to be clear, when you say they didn't know, like it wasn't like you could go to the store and buy a copy of Maya at this point to make a 3D tool. You had to buy an SGI workstation, get some really hyper specific programs. So they were learning how to do the 3D part of this, right? But and they were working on building the tools and all of that stuff. But really they couldn't build the level editor until the level spec was finished, and they couldn't have the level spec finished until the engine capabilities were finished. And like it was just a series of in software you call it a blocker, right? So anytime one person's work is blocking a bunch of other people's work, you're in a situation. So Carmack and John Cash and Mike Abrash and a couple other people were working on this engine side that was essentially blocking the entire other half of the studio. So at this point, Romero was, by his own account, working on stuff like Final Doom and Ultimate Doom, which were retail box copies of Doom 1 that could go out through the GT Interactive deal and end up in Walmart so we could all buy them again. And then also working with Raven, essentially producing Heretic for Raven, and working on other like merchandise and licensing stuff, as well as like doing the tool thing. But what Carmack apparently expected was something a little bit different.
Yeah. The story from, and this was in magazines, like Carmack gave some quotes in 96, 97, when all this stuff had happened, basically kind of, he alluded to Romero kind of not doing much. Like basically the narrative was that he kind of bought into his fame, his newfound fame and money and rockstar image, and was kind of not contributing.
Yeah.
By Romero's account, he was doing plenty to advance the revenue interests of the company. It just not much of that was related to Quake, the next project. And so like, you can see how maybe in Carmack's very focused mind, like if you're not working on the next big game, you're not doing anything kind of thing. You know what I mean? It's like, but from Romero's perspective, like, hey, if I'm making the company money, then that's just as good. And it seems like that might be where the disconnect happened.
The thing that the tragedy of this whole thing, and it does come across like an actual like tragedy, right?
It really
because
does.
If there had been one person on this team who was able to have a conversation like a grown ass adult, and say, hey, I think, instead of saying, I think, for example, Carmack came to a shareholder meeting with a report card for everybody and was like, everybody gets A's except for Romero, who gets a D or something.
Yeah, I think it was an email, actually. I think, did he send an email out? And people just came into the office one day and found a mass email where he had... Carmack had given everybody a letter grade on what he saw their performance to be.
And just to be clear, almost all equals in terms of company structure at this point.
Like,
so
yeah, in terms of ownership,
ownership and structure. So having like that kind of, hey, I'm the only one here working on this at 3 o'clock in the morning, like, and I'm pissed off about it vibe, along with not valuing, like at the end of this chapter, Romero says, the thing I have regrets about is that I looked at what Nintendo did monetizing Mario and their brands, and I looked at how poorly we monetized Doom, and we should have made so much more money because we didn't even sell t-shirts. Like they weren't even selling t-shirts, right? They did nothing with that brand that was every bit as important and as big as a Nintendo brand, but made a fraction of the money.
Yeah.
And Carmack didn't care about the money.
Yeah.
Which is fair. Like, I get that.
Yeah. Well, he cared about money, but he just wanted to make games to get the money. Like he didn't want to sell t-shirts or worry about ports and Walmart bundles.
Well, and the thing that's saddest about the whole thing of it to me is like, it sounded almost like the thing Carmack wanted was the times that he had with Romero in those early dev days where they would sit down and bang it out together.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that he was upset about, but he wasn't able to say that.
They kind of all but do say that in here, that he more or less, when it came to a head and they fired Romero / he kind of sounded like he wanted out anyway at that point. But like he all but said basically like he wished Romero had kind of been there by his side, also coding through this process and like kind of contributing more to the development of the technology. I mean, we glossed over a little bit, but Carmack was the only programmer until Quake, and they brought in Abrash, who was like an absolute legend and
Cash
and Cash was a very strong network programmer, but like Abrash in particular was like a god of assembly language, x86 assembly that they brought in. The point being, like, it was more than Carmack could deal with on his own, and it seems like he wished Romero had been more attentive to the core technical development of what Quake was going to be. And some of the other things he said after Romero was out at the time were he didn't like that Romero had been out to the press talking about the big RPG tinged ideas for Quake because they ended up not delivering that. What they ended up doing when the tech was finally ready, they were so burned out from like making and throwing out work and making more work and et cetera as the tech was coming together. By the time they got there, they were just like so exhausted. They said, let's just make another shooter. Like that's why Quake at the end of the day has basically the same weapons as Doom and is basically the same kind of game with better tech. Is let's just make what we know. Nobody's got the energy to actually make this big, totally different game now, which Romero didn't love, but Carmack seemed to kind of pin it on him that he had promised this to the world and then they didn't deliver it.
Well, which is funny because like they when they made Doom, they sent out a press release. It's the exact same thing, right? Yeah. It's like here are the technical advancements. Here's the story. Here's the stuff. Anyway,
yeah. But yeah, so like all of this culminates in the most affecting part of this book, and not everybody would agree about this, but for me, who was a huge fan of this stuff at the time and was like super bummed that this worked out the way it did, it's nice to read this little postmortem they did, but it also it's the most tragic thing in this book. He basically ends this whole saga where he leaves id by accounting some conversations he's had with John Carmack recently, where they went back. They finally, after all this time, went back and talked about.
Hold on, before we get to this though.
Okay, yeah.
The saddest part for me was when he described the launch when they uploaded the shareware for Quake to the BBS.
Yeah,
or FTP, I guess at that point, which is like he's on IRC or talking to admins at the channel is like, hey, you guys have got to lay off the FTP server so I can get a connection to log in and upload the software. Because right now no one can get on because you guys are all hammering this FTP because you know it's coming. But he's the only one in the office. Right. There's no, like, you launch a game, usually there's a celebration, right? It's like, hey, thank God we're done. This is a good time. We're all good. On this one, he was the only one there. He was uploading it by himself. He did the packaging himself, all of that stuff, which is like really sad, but also profoundly uncool that somebody that they would spend all this time working on this game and then nobody's even there to help him spot check, like double check his work for him. Right.
Yeah.
It's the lights fading down, the hard vignette on the scene. Like there's like, they describe the war room that they're in as like shitty folding tables where everybody's just in a big U around the room. I assume there's like kind of janky blinds on the windows that are kind of fucked up all over.
Yes, you absolutely
just like a slow pan back as the violins play.
Yes, you can picture that. Absolutely. Yeah. It's worth pointing out after they made that decision to just make a shooter, the last 6 or 8 months of that game where they forced themselves to all move their desks into the same room. And it sounded like the work atmosphere at that point was not fun.
It sounded like the shittiest crunch I've ever heard of, just to be, not to minimize anybody else's crunch. Because I know the crunch is always bad, but damn.
Okay. I've got to read this passage now because when I hit this part in this book, I went back and reread this like 5 times because it bummed me out so much having followed the development of this stuff at the time when it was happening. Or especially directly thereafter. But okay, so this is them, Carmack and Romero, talking about what they could have done differently. Regarding Quake, Carmack recently suggested to me that he thought we could have split Quake's technology advances into 2 games. The first game would have used the Doom 2 engine and a new client-server networking model and a Doom C programming language. That's important. Actually, I completely forgot about that. That was another one of the Quake innovations was Quake C, which was a like low-level scripting / programming language that you use to make mods, because prior to that, like Doom mods, like Doom Total Conversions had just been in the form of like maps with new graphics. Like you could put new sprites and textures in. Yeah. But you couldn't mess with the underlying game logic and mechanics very much. Yeah. You could reskin enemies, but you couldn't like change their behaviors necessarily. Right. And things like this happened because in Wolfenstein, they left the people were able to create their own maps and dump them in and replace existing maps. Yeah. With Doom, they were a little bit more intentional and like set up a structure and people built Doom editors and stuff like that. With Quake, they wanted to make that an explicit part of the game where not only could you create new maps and new skins for enemies and characters and players, but also
write new game logic, which was like super novel. Ended up having a bunch of exploits over the years, but like it's a cool thing. Quake C.
Yeah. Like Quake C is what led to Capture the Flag. Like that Capture the Flag happened. 3-wave CTF happened less than 6 months, I think, after the game came out. Like
you
later
couldn't
that
have had
year.
a grapple hook without that.
The grappling hook and the flag mechanics you couldn't have put in there without Quake C. So the first game would have used the Doom 2 engine with a new client server networking model and a Doom C programming language. The second game would have been Quake with the true 3D world and advanced lighting. That idea makes a lot of sense to me and would have allowed us to progress more quickly. In a similar vein, it also seems that putting aside some new engine features and moving on to gameplay code at an earlier point would have allowed us and the rest of the design team to progress the gameplay much faster. Both of these methods would have kept everyone fully tasked and allow for new products to come out.
Like this is why this is a tragedy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
it's
like
because
reading that.
Like if they had not been pissed off at each other to the point that they stopped talking to each other aside from work stuff, this is a natural, there's a natural progression here.
Right.
I mean, part of it is probably Carmack's ego at the time saying, oh, I can figure this out. It's no big deal. I've done all these engines. And like I wrote the original, the 3D Mario render or the 2D Mario renderer in a weekend. You know, I don't think anyone having lived through this time, nobody really appreciated how much harder the 3D stuff was than the 2D stuff.
Yeah.
I think including Carmack and the smart people of the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, this was a bummer.
Yeah, it really is. It really is.
Now, the other side of that, though, is if he had released the client server architecture first, then that means they would have realized that the initial no network prediction, no lag compensation model wouldn't work. And probably fixing that would have stalled them out in a completely different way at a different time because he would have had to do the Quake World work.
Right.
After Doom 3, the speculative Doom 3, not after Quake when there was downtime. So yeah, I don't know.
Who knows? Historical counterfactuals are always hard to figure out, but it's a real bummer. Not just that this happened and the way it happened, but especially seeing this like very measured accounting of what they could have done to not make this happen and to give the world more games and to introduce this technology in a healthier and less destructive way.
Yeah. So
it's rough.
The last thing, can we talk about MLOOK real quick? Because this is my favorite. Like the after having done the first person shooter controller episode a few weeks ago, I was thinking about this because actually the Logitech deal that ends with Romero on those magazine ads that we called out is mentioned in the book. But he says, hey, as part of fixing and polishing everything, mouse control needed to be fixed. Carmack and I talked about allowing the mouse to control not just left and right, but also up and down by moving the mouse in both axes fluidly. The idea would be to move the mouse around like you do on a desktop, but instead of moving a mouse pointer, you would be moving your eyes in the game, looking in all directions. Moving the mouse left and right would look around like Wolfenstein 3D and Doom, but moving the mouse forward and backward would let you look straight up at one extreme and straight down at your feet at the other. Moving the mouse along each of those axes would feel like you're looking around in 360 degrees, just like in real life. Carmack spent 10 minutes programming the new axes of control into the game. When it first got into the latest build, it felt bizarre. It was dizzying to look around with the mouse while at the same time moving around with the keyboard. This is the same experience everybody who tried MLOOK had at the beginning.
Yeah.
I wondered how players would ever get used to it. It felt like the right way to solve the problem, though. And this was the birth of what was now called MouseLook and is a staple of all 3D controlled games.
Yes.
They kept the feature in, but left it inactive by default, which I love.
Famously, you had to pull down the console and type plus MLOOK to actually enable this.
The other thing about that, though, is that that's what introduced me to using the config files to script stuff and to change your control bindings and all that stuff.
Absolutely.
Because I knew that you could do that, and I had to do that to get MLOOK on. I eventually didn't want to have to type MLOOK every time I started the game. So I was like, well, how can I automate this? And then that opened the door to a whole world of like noodling with the PC that resulted in where I am now.
Totally. Like editing in autoexec.cfg was a good introduction to what a config file was, like using key bindings was a good introduction to that kind of thing. Because you could bind any command to any button, so you could bind a key to turn on and off MLOOK dynamically whenever you wanted. Like you
writing a rocket jump macro, so that you could do there's a whole host of things. Anyway, the book's incredible. We're not going to get into the Ion Storm stuff. The one thing, if you're concerned about reading this because of the John Romero will make you his bitch ad, he tells the story of how that happened and is like completely like acknowledges the level of error that was, even by 90s video game ad standards. The Ion Storm saga seems like
it's not as detailed as the id Software passage, but he does go into quite a bit of detail about how the funding came together, like the business interests that were involved and who they were working with, like mistakes they made in terms of like project management and hiring and culture and all of that stuff. And he does cop to, he's somewhat contrite about the ad campaign stuff. And ultimately later in the book, like he very much, I think you highlighted a passage, like he very much is upfront about his character flaws and like what led to some of the problems at id and Ion Storm.
Yeah. I mean,
he does not try to pass the buck, I would say.
No, I think it's a very, I was really like, I came off very sympathetic after reading this, which I guess, it's a memoir, so you're going to be sympathetic, but, but he specifically says, as a child, when things got bad, I stayed quiet and waited for it to pass. When Carmack sent out his report card, I stayed quiet and waited for it to pass. When people were upset at things happening with an Ion Storm, I stayed quiet and waited for it to pass. Everything that happened in Ion Storm is a direct result of that flaw in my character. Had I taken action, had I talked to people, had I prevented issues from developing when they were just emerging, so many things in my career and in my life would have been different, and so many people would have been spared the difficulties this flaw created.
Yeah, like I said, like he's very blunt about it.
Yeah, it's a lesson that takes a lot of us take a long time to understand. Anyway, I think that's as good a place as any. Yeah, I could talk about this book for another 2 hours probably.
Easily. There's so much fun stuff in here. Like if you love that era of 90s shooters, like you absolutely should read this book. There's a ton of fun stuff in there. And again, there's quite a bit more after the id Software stuff. That's obviously sort of like the high point or the climax, but it's there's still a ton of book left on Ion Storm, like the work he did in mobile games afterward.
The stuff about Sigil and Sigil 2 is fabulous too.
Yeah. Sigil, the Sigil episodes for Doom are fantastic. I'd highly recommend playing those. And he talks about those. He talks about the failed Black Room demo or the failed Kickstarter.
Like a pitch. It's basically a pitch, a Kickstarter program. Yeah. Like he got in on the Kickstarter train.
Yes. And he talks quite a bit about why that didn't come together and why they had to cancel it and stuff. There's pretty much his entire career up to the present is quite well illustrated or described.
I think it's a fascinating look into a time that I look back fondly on, and sure. The more insight is good. I feel bad for the time that Ion Storm and John Romero were kind of the poster child of excess in game development, because it seems like he was on a train that was a little bit out of his control at that point.
Yeah, it does kind of come off that way. Doom Guy Life in First Person. Go pick it up. I highly recommend it.
Yeah, it's very good. And on that note, that'll do it for us this week. As always, Brad and Will Made a Tech Pod is listener supported. So if you like the show and you like us to keep doing this, please consider joining the Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/techpod. And for $5 a month, you get access to the fabulous Tech Pod Discord and the patron exclusive episode where this month we talked about FFmpeg and Slime.
FFmpeg and Slime, arguably kind of the same thing.
I mean, it's two sides of the same coin. As always, a huge thank you to our executive producer, all our patrons, but also a special thank you to our executive producer tier patrons, including Paddle Creek Games Makers of Fractured Veil, Andrew Slosky, Jordan Lippett, Bunny Crimes and the Infinite Sadness. Somebody's going through a Smashing Pumpkins phase. Just Wedge, Joel Krauska, Twinkle Twinkie, David Allen, James Kamek, and Pantheon, makers of the HS3 high-speed 3D printer. Thank you all so much.
Yes, thank you.
And that will do it for us this week. We will be back next week with another Tech Pod. Thanks for listening, everybody. Bye. Bye.